The gates of Arizona's Florence prison creaked open at 6:47 a.m. on March 15, 2024. Ford Miller stepped into freedom with a single plastic bag in his hands, containing his meager belongings: a worn wallet with a 7-year-old driver's license, a faded photograph, and $127, money he had earned in the prison laundry. The desert wind of Arizona burned his face, reminding him of the world he had left behind 7 years ago. Ford was a different man then. He had a house in North Tucson, a successful construction business, and a family. Now, at 48, he looked older. Deep wrinkles lined his face, his hair had turned gray, and his shoulders slumped under the weight of his experiences. The bus to Tucson was leaving in an hour. Ford sat down on a bench in front of the bus station and took a crumpled photograph out of his pocket. In the picture, he was hugging Debbie and her daughter Casey during their trip to the Grand Canyon in 2015. Casey was 14 at the time, laughing and pointing at something off camera. Debbie was leaning against his shoulder, a happy smile on her face. "What a fool I was," Ford muttered, tucking the photo back into his wallet. Memories flooded back, transporting him to that fateful day, October 23, 2017. He was working at the construction site of a new shopping center on Oracle Road when he saw police cars pulling up to his house. Ford immediately left work and rushed home, thinking of an accident or a robbery. But when he saw Debbie and Casey standing on the porch surrounded by police officers, his heart sank with a sense of foreboding. "Ford Miller?" Detective Rodriguez addressed him. "You are under arrest on charges of domestic violence and lewd conduct with a minor." His world collapsed in an instant. Debbie wouldn't look him in the eye, and Casey was sobbing, clinging to her mother. Neighbors poured into the street, watching as he was handcuffed and put into a police car. "This is a mistake," he shouted. "Debbie, tell them!" Casey. But his wife remained silent, and his stepdaughter only cried louder. At the police station, the charges against him were read aloud. Debbie stated that he had been violent toward her for a year, and 16-year-old Casey said that her stepfather had been mistreating her since May 2017. The police had photographs of Debbie's bruises, a medical report confirming Casey's injuries, and testimony from their neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, who reported hearing loud cries and calls for help. The court-appointed lawyer turned out to be an overworked young man with no experience. He advised Ford to make a deal with the prosecution, to agree to a shorter sentence in exchange for a guilty plea. "But I'm innocent," Ford protested. "Mr. Miller, they have victim statements, medical evidence, and a witness. Juries rarely acquit in cases like this," the lawyer replied. Ford refused the deal and demanded a trial. It was a fatal mistake. The trial lasted 3 weeks. Debbie took the stand and recounted years of psychological and physical terror. She said she remained silent out of fear that Ford would kill her and her daughter if they told anyone. Casey testified via video link to avoid additional trauma. Her testimony was detailed and emotional. She described how her stepfather would come into her room at night, how he would force her to remain silent, how she was afraid to tell her mother. Ford watched it all as if in a fog. The person he loved like his own daughter, the person for whom he worked overtime to pay for her dance lessons and class trips, was accusing him of the most heinous crimes. His own testimony sounded weak against the backdrop of the emotional accounts of the victims. He had no alibi for the specific dates Casey named. His lawyer was unable to find any significant contradictions in the testimony. The jury deliberated for 2 days and returned with a guilty verdict on all counts. Judge Harper sentenced him to 10 years in prison under strict conditions. "Mr. Miller," the judge said during sentencing, "you abused the trust of a family and caused irreparable harm to a child. Society must be protected from people like you." The bus braked sharply at the Tucson bus station, pulling Ford out of his memories. The city greeted him with blazing sun and dust. The Santa Catalina Mountains rose to the north, reminding him of a home that was no longer there. Ford's first stop was the parole office. Officer Martinez, an older woman with tired eyes, explained the conditions of his release. "You are required to check in here every week, live at the address provided, not leave Pima County without permission, and not come within 500 feet of the victims," she read monotonously. "Where am I supposed to live?" Ford asked. "There's a motel on South 6th Avenue that takes people in your situation. Landlords don't usually rent to ex-convicts, especially for crimes like this." The Desert Star Motel turned out to be a shabby red brick building on the outskirts of town, next to a car repair shop and a self-service laundromat. The room cost $180 a week, almost all of his money. Inside, there was worn furniture, Cold War-era air conditioning, and the smell of disinfectant, which couldn't mask the other, less pleasant aromas. Ford sat on the edge of the bed and took out the photo again. Over the past 7 years, he had asked himself the question thousands of times. Why? Why did Debbie do it? Why did Casey lie? What happened while he was away? On the nightstand was an old Tucson phone book. Ford found the number for directory assistance and got Debbie's address. She still lived in their old house on Rolling Hills Drive, the house he had paid the mortgage on for 15 years. The next morning, Ford went looking for a job. Construction companies turned him down as soon as they saw the 7-year gap in his employment history. He didn't mention prison, but employers understood anyway. "We need workers with current experience," one company after another told him. By evening, he found a job washing dishes at Uncle Sam's Diner on Grant Road for $12 an hour. The manager, a young guy with tattoos on his neck, didn't even ask about his previous work experience. "You can start tomorrow at 6 in the morning. Be late and you're out," he said. His first day at his new job passed in a fog. Ford washed dishes and remembered the days when he led a team of 20 people, building shopping centers and residential complexes. Now his hands were elbow-deep in soapy water, and his boss was 20 years younger than him. During his lunch break, he bought a local newspaper and found the obituaries and society column. There was a photo that took his breath away. Debbie Miller at a charity event at a local church. She looked good, even better than 7 years ago. Expensive clothes, professional hairstyle, smile. Next to her stood a tall man whom the caption identified as Mark Thompson, partner. Ford recognized him. It was Debbie's ex-husband, Casey's biological father, who had abandoned the family when the girl was 2 years old. So, had old love proven stronger? Or had he returned upon learning that the husband was gone but the house remained? Ford read the article over and over, feeling something dark and cold growing in his chest. Over the past 7 years, he had convinced himself that he had forgiven them, that he understood. Maybe they really were afraid of him. Maybe there was something in their relationship that he hadn't noticed. But this photo destroyed all his rationalizations. Debbie was happy. Debbie was thriving. And he was washing dishes in a diner and living in a motel for losers. That evening, Ford rode a rented bike to their old neighborhood. The house looked better than when he had left it 7 years ago. New fence, manicured lawn, fresh paint. A new Chevrolet Silverado was parked in the driveway. He parked his bike at the house next door and watched. At 9 o'clock, the living room light came on. Ford saw the silhouettes of Debbie and Mark through the loosely drawn curtains. They were watching TV. She was leaning on his shoulder just as she used to lean on Ford. At that moment, something inside him finally broke. He had spent 7 years in a cage, surrounded by drug addicts and murderers, considered one of the worst, a pedophile. For 7 years, he had been beaten, humiliated, and despised even by other prisoners. And she had been living in his house with another man, spending his money and, apparently, telling everyone what a terrible person he was. Ford slowly drove back to the motel, plans forming in his head with frightening clarity. He would find out the truth, he would find evidence, and he would make them pay for what they had done to him. The first 2 weeks of freedom were a daily reminder to Ford Miller of how much the world had changed in the 7 years he had been away. Technologies that had once seemed simple now presented difficulties. At the supermarket, he stood in front of the self-checkout for 10 minutes, unable to figure out how to scan his items. A young security guard looked at him suspiciously until an elderly cashier came over to help. "These things are new," she said sympathetically. "Many older people can't figure them out." Ford didn't bother to explain that it wasn't a matter of age. Working at Uncle Sam's proved to be physically exhausting. After 7 years of prison and limited activity, his body was not ready for 12-hour shifts on his feet. By the end of the first week, his hands were covered with sores from constant contact with cleaning products, and his back hurt so much that he could barely sleep on the worn-out motel mattress. Worse than the physical pain was the social isolation. His co-workers, mostly teenagers and young immigrants, avoided talking to him. They instinctively sensed that something was wrong with him, even though they didn't know the specific details of his past. "Hey man, where are you from?" Miguel, a 17-year-old cook, asked him one day. "From the city," Ford replied curtly, continuing to wash the dishes. "No, I mean you're not from around here, are you?" "You talk kind of funny." Ford realized that 7 years of prison slang and careful speech had changed even his manner of speaking. In prison, extra words could cost you your life, so he had learned to express himself concisely and precisely, always keeping his emotions under control. In the third week, Ford decided to find his former lawyer. Richard Stevens was still working at the same office on Speedway Boulevard, although now he had his own office and a secretary. Ford Miller. Stevens rose from his desk as his secretary ushered in the unexpected visitor. The lawyer had aged, his hair had turned gray, but overall he looked successful. "I didn't expect to see you. I'm out on parole. I want to talk about my case." Stevens gestured to the chair in front of the desk, but remained standing, his arms crossed over his chest. "Ford, I understand your desire to review the case, but the statute of limitations on appeals has expired. Too much time has passed. I'm not talking about an appeal. I'm talking about what really happened back then." The lawyer paused, studying Ford's face. Over the years of practice, he had learned to read his clients, and what he saw made him sit down. "What do you mean?" "You knew the case was bogus. I saw it in your eyes back then, in the courtroom." Stevens leaned back in his chair and was silent for a long time. Finally, he spoke, choosing his words carefully. "Ford, I had a lot of cases back then. I was young, inexperienced. Maybe I didn't do everything right." "What exactly did you not do right?" "I didn't check some things properly. The medical reports, for example. I took them at face value, didn't hire an independent expert." Ford leaned forward. "What about the medical reports?" "The girl had injuries, that's a fact. But I never investigated their origin. The doctor said they were consistent with sexual assault, and I didn't dig any deeper." "What if you had dug deeper?" Stevens stood up and walked over to the window, looking at the stream of cars below. "There are many reasons why a teenager might have such injuries. An active sex life with peers, for example, or other forms of coercion." "What are you trying to say?" "Nothing specific. I was just too green at the time to ask the right questions." Ford realized that the lawyer was hiding something, but he didn't press further. He had gotten what he needed, confirmation of his suspicions that the case had been built on shaky grounds. "Is there any way to get the case files now?" "They should be in the court archives." "But Ford," Stevens turned to him, "even if there are inconsistencies, it won't help you legally. The case is closed, the sentence has been served. It's better to start your life over." "For me, the case is not closed," Ford said, standing up. "Thank you for your honesty." "At least partially." That same day, Ford went to the county court archives. An elderly clerk looked at his documents and shook his head. "Cases like this are classified. You need official permission or a lawyer." "What if I'm the defendant in this case?" "Then you can only get your part of the documents, and not all of them. The testimony of the minor victim will remain confidential." Ford paid $50 for copies and received a stack of documents. He remembered most of them, but some details stood out with new force. Casey's medical report was dated October 25, 2017, 2 days after his arrest. The doctor noted injuries consistent with sexual assault, presumably occurring within the last 48 to 72 hours. Ford reread that line several times. If the injuries were inflicted 48 to 72 hours before the examination, that meant sometime between October 22nd and 23rd. But on October 22nd, he had been working on a construction site from 6 a.m. to 10 p.m. He had an alibi that could be confirmed by 12 workers. Why didn't Stevens check this at the time? It got more interesting. The testimony of Mrs. Patterson, a neighbor, contained a strange detail. She claimed to have heard cries for help and sounds of a struggle around midnight on October 20th. But in the police report, Debbie claimed that the last incident of violence occurred on the morning of October 21st. Why did no one notice this contradiction? Ford spent the next few days researching his old contacts. Many of the builders he had worked with had left town or changed professions, but he found the number of Jack Morales, his former foreman. Ford? Hell, man, how are you? Jack sounded genuinely pleased. I always thought something was off about you in that story. Why did you think that? Come on, man. I knew you for 5 years. You were the calmest guy on the job site. You never raised your voice, even when everything was going to hell. And I saw how you interacted with Casey at the company party, like a caring father. Could you confirm that I was working on October 22nd? Sure, I still have the old timesheets. You worked overtime that day, I remember. We were pouring the foundation, and you stayed until the very end. This was the first real lead. Ford wrote down Jack's contact information and asked him to find other witnesses from that day. That evening, on his way home from work, Ford drove past his old house again. This time, he saw more details. There were toys in the yard, a child's bicycle and a sandbox, so Debbie and Mark had a child. Suddenly, the front door opened and Mark Thompson himself came out. He hadn't changed much in 7 years. Same tall stature, broad shoulders, thick beard. Ford remembered him as a drunk and a fighter who had abandoned pregnant Debbie and disappeared from Casey's life. Mark headed for the mailbox and Ford quickly looked away, pretending he was just driving by. But he noticed the main thing. The man looked prosperous. Expensive shoes, a gold watch, the well-groomed appearance of someone who hadn't worried about money in a long time. How could a truck driver get so rich in 7 years? The next day was Saturday, and Ford decided to find Casey. At an internet cafe for $2 an hour, he found her on social media. Casey Thompson, she had taken back her father's surname, lived in the Saguaro East Trailer Park on the southern outskirts of Tucson. Her profile told a sad story. The photos showed a young woman with tired eyes holding a 2-year-old child in her arms. The posts were infrequent and mostly about money problems, car trouble, and looking for work. Does anyone know where I can get free diapers? It's a week until payday and my baby is out, she wrote a month ago. My car broke down, I can't get to work. If anyone is going to the Grant Road area in the morning, please give me a ride. Read another post. The contrast was striking. Debbie lived comfortably in a house that once belonged to Ford, while her daughter was barely making ends meet in a trailer. Ford printed out the address and drove to Saguaro East. The trailer park was a depressing sight. Rows of old mobile homes, many in need of repair. Children played in the dust between the trailers, while adults sat on the steps drinking beer from cans. Casey's house was one of the worst. An old trailer with pieces of siding falling off and plastic windows taped with duct tape. In the yard stood a mangled baby carriage and a pile of old tires. Ford parked his bike 100 yards away and watched. Around 4 o'clock in the afternoon, Casey came out of the trailer with a child in her arms. She looked much older than her 23 years, thin, pale, dressed in cheap clothes from the supermarket. The child was crying and she was trying to calm him down. They walked to the bus stop and waited a long time. When the bus finally arrived, Casey counted the change in her wallet before paying the fare. Ford followed the bus on his bike. Casey got off at the Fry's supermarket and headed inside. Half an hour later, she came out with a plastic bag containing milk, bread, and a jar of baby food, the bare essentials. Watching her, Ford felt a strange mixture of emotions. This girl had ruined his life with her lies, but now she was in a desperate situation herself. Where was her mother? Why wasn't Debbie helping her daughter? On the way back to the motel, Ford drove past his old house again. Now there was another car in the driveway, a brand new Lexus. Through the living room window, he could see Debbie and Mark entertaining guests. There were bottles of wine on the table and people were laughing. While Debbie's own daughter lived in slums and scrimped on diapers, her mother threw parties in a house bought with money from a man she had sent to prison on false charges. Ford hardly slept that night. He lay on the creaky motel bed and planned his next steps. The picture was starting to become clearer, but many details still remained in the shadows. Why did Casey lie? What made a 16-year-old girl accuse a man who cared for her like his own daughter of pedophilia? And why did Debbie abandon her daughter after getting what she wanted? Ford was sure of one thing. He wouldn't stop until he found the answers to these questions. And when he did, the guilty parties would pay for every day they spent behind bars. Ford's fourth week of freedom brought him his first real breakthrough in the investigation. Jack Morales not only found the October 2017 timesheets, but also contacted 3 workers who remembered that day. "Listen, Ford," Jack said on the phone. "I talked to Raul, Dave, and Steve. They all remember that you worked until 11 p.m. on October 22nd. We were pouring the foundation for the new wing of the shopping center, and you supervised the process until the very end. Are they willing to give written statements?" "Of course." Raul even found photos from that day. He was taking pictures of the pouring process for the report. "You're clearly visible in them. It was a bombshell. If the medical examination showed that Casey's injuries were sustained on October 22nd to 23rd, and he was at the construction site surrounded by witnesses the whole time, the charges would collapse like a house of cards." Ford met with Raul Sanchez at a cafe near his new workplace. His former colleague brought a folder with documents and photos. "To be honest, I always knew something was wrong with your case," Raul said, handing him the photos. "You were a good man, Ford. A fair boss. When I heard about the accusations, I couldn't believe it." Ford was clearly visible in the photos, standing next to a concrete mixer and pointing in the direction of the pour. The time on the digital photos was 10:34 p.m. "Why didn't any of you contact my lawyer back then?" Raul shrugged awkwardly. "No one asked us. And then, you know how people are about these things. No one wants to get involved." The next step was to find an independent medical expert. Ford spent his last savings on a consultation with Dr. Elizabeth Clark, a former medical examiner who now worked as a private consultant. Dr. Clark studied the medical report on Casey's case for an hour, frowning and making notes from time to time. "An interesting document," she finally said. The colleague who signed this report made some controversial conclusions. "In what sense?" "Determining the time of injury in cases like this is very difficult. Dr. Hammond indicated a time frame of 48 to 72 hours, but that is extremely imprecise. Injuries like these could have been sustained a week before the examination. Could they have been the result of other causes rather than coercion?" Dr. Clark looked at him intently. "Are you referring to consensual sexual activity?" "Theoretically, yes. A sexually active 16-year-old girl could have similar changes, but for some reason, Dr. Hammond did not consider this possibility." "What else bothers you about the conclusion?" "The nature of the injuries. If there had been coercion by an adult male, well, you know what I mean, the injuries would have been more severe. What is described here is more likely the result of an inexperienced or rough partner of approximately the same age." Ford felt the puzzle pieces starting to fall into place. "Can you provide a written conclusion?" "For an additional fee, yes. But understand, It won't help you legally. The case has long been closed. I need the truth, not legal help." That evening, Ford decided to return to the Saguaro East Trailer Park. This time, he wanted to try to talk to Casey's neighbors, perhaps learn something about her life. The neighboring trailer belonged to an elderly woman named Dolores Martinez. She was sitting on the steps, smoking a cigarette, and watching the children play. "Do you know Casey?" Ford asked cautiously. "Who are you?" Dolores replied suspiciously. "An old family friend. I'm worried about her." The woman looked him up and down. "She's a good girl. It's hard for her with a child and no husband." "What about the child's father?" "Some boy. He ran away as soon as he found out she was pregnant. Casey said she was 16 when it all started." Ford's heart skipped a beat. If Casey got pregnant at 16, that was around the time he was under investigation. "Doesn't her mother help her?" Dolores snorted. "What mother?" "That rich bitch abandoned her daughter as soon as she got what she wanted. Casey said her mother lives in a big house with a new man and can't even afford to buy her diapers." "Did they have a falling out?" "That's not the word for it. Casey came to her mother's house once to ask for money for the child's treatment. She didn't even open the door. She said through the intercom that they were going their separate ways now." "When was that?" "About 2 years ago. Casey came back then and cried all night. I could hear her through the wall." Ford thanked Dolores and continued on through the trailer park. The information painted an alarming picture. Debbie got rid of her daughter right after she got what she wanted. But what exactly did she get? The answer came the next day in the most unexpected way. Ford was washing dishes at Uncle Sam's when he overheard a conversation at the next table. 2 middle-aged men were discussing real estate. "The house on Rolling Hills is now worth at least $400,000, and the Millers bought it for $150,000 in 2003. "The Millers? The ones whose husband was in prison for pedophilia?" "Yeah, I remember the whole scandal. But the woman was lucky. After her husband's arrest, she got the house through an expedited divorce, plus the insurance paid out." "What insurance?" "Life insurance. The man had a $500,000 policy. When he was arrested, his wife filed papers saying he was socially dead to her, and the insurance company paid out 70% of the amount." Ford almost dropped his plate. Insurance payout for social death? Such policies existed, but payouts were rare and required special circumstances. During his lunch break, he called Farmers Insurance, where he had a policy. "Ford Miller?" "Let's check," said the employee. "Yes, there is a record of a payment under policy number for $350,000 in favor of Debbie Miller in March 2018. "On what grounds?" "Loss of the family breadwinner as a result of a life sentence for a serious crime. You had an additional option in the policy." Ford didn't remember any additional option, but now the motive was crystal clear. Debbie got a house worth $400,000 plus $350,000 in insurance, a total of $750,000 for sending her husband to prison. That evening, Ford drove back to the house on Rolling Hills. This time he parked not in front, but in an alley behind the house, from where he could see the backyard. There was a children's trampoline and an expensive barbecue grill. Around 8 o'clock in the evening, a child came out into the yard, a boy of about 5 with dark hair. Debbie and Mark followed him, a family idyll. Ford watched them play with the child, laughing and looking happy. Debbie was wearing an expensive tracksuit, Mark a designer shirt. A gold watch glinted on his wrist. Suddenly, Ford heard a familiar voice. He turned and saw Casey walking down the alley with a stroller. She stopped at the fence of her orphanage and stared at the happy scene in the yard for a long time. There was so much pain and longing on the girl's face that Ford felt a pang of sympathy. Debbie and Mark didn't notice their daughter. They were too busy playing with their new baby. Casey stood there for another minute, then turned the stroller around and walked back. Ford saw her shoulders shaking. She was crying. The next day, Ford decided to try to find someone who could shed light on the events of 7 years ago. He remembered his neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, whose testimony had been one of the key pieces of evidence for the prosecution. Margaret Patterson still lived in the same house next to his former home. She was a woman in her 70s, a widow who spent most of her time watching her neighbors from her window. When Ford approached her door, he saw the curtain on the window twitch. Mrs. Patterson was home, but she was in no hurry to open the door. "Mrs. Patterson? I'm Ford Miller. Do you remember me?" A long pause, then a voice from behind the door. "Go away. I have nothing to say to you. Please, I need to talk to you." "Just 5 minutes. I said go away." Ford didn't give up. "I know you lied in court." "Why?" Another long pause. Then the door slowly opened. Mrs. Patterson looked much older than she had 7 years ago. Her face was gaunt, her eyes restless. "5 minutes," she said, letting him in. The house was just as Ford remembered it. Old-fashioned furniture, knitted doilies, photographs of her late husband on the mantelpiece. "What do you want?" Mrs. Patterson asked, without offering him a seat. "The truth. You didn't hear any screams on October 20th, did you?" The old woman pressed her lips together and turned away. "Did Debbie pay you or threaten you?" "You don't understand," Mrs. Patterson said suddenly. "I had no choice." "Explain." "She knew about my son Tommy." Ford frowned. He remembered Mrs. Patterson's son, a man in his 40s who sometimes visited his mother. A quiet, shy man. "What did she know?" "Tommy has problems with alcohol, and when he drinks." The woman's voice trembled. 2 years ago, he hit a cyclist. Drunk. The man was left disabled and Debbie saw it. Tommy came to me that night in a panic. The car was dented. Debbie was coming back from the night shift and saw everything. She said that if I didn't testify against you, she would tell the police about Tommy. Ford felt rage rising in his chest. "So you lied to protect your son?" "What would you have done in my place?" Mrs. Patterson snapped. "Tommy is all I have. Since my husband died, he's the only one who cares about me. I couldn't. Because of your lies, I spent 7 years in prison." "I know," the old woman cried. "Do you think I don't suffer?" "I think about it every night, but I couldn't send my own son to prison." Ford looked at her with disgust and pity at the same time. Another victim of Debbie's manipulation. "Are you ready to tell the truth now?" Mrs. Patterson shook her head. "The statute of limitations on Tommy's case hasn't expired yet. If I confess to perjury, the police will start an investigation. Tommy will go to prison. What about justice?" "It won't give you back 7 years, Ford, but it could destroy what's left of my family." Leaving Mrs. Patterson's house, Ford felt devastated. Every thread of the investigation led to the same picture. Debbie had methodically and cold-bloodedly destroyed his life for money. She blackmailed her neighbor, forced her daughter to lie, got the house and the insurance money, and then abandoned Casey to her fate. But the most important discovery was something else. At an internet cafe, Ford found the archives of a local newspaper for 2017. In the November 15th issue, there was a small note that Mark Thompson had returned to Tucson after 15 years of working as a long-haul truck driver across the country. That meant Mark had arrived in town 3 weeks after Ford's arrest. Too much of a coincidence. That evening, Ford sat in his motel room, laying out all the evidence he had collected on the bed, like a detective from a TV series. The timeline was clear. October 2017. False accusations against Ford November 2017. Mark's return to Tucson March 2018. Debbie's insurance payout 2018 to 2019. Casey's childbirth, her expulsion from the family 2020 to 2024. Debbie and Mark's happy life. But one link was still missing. Why did Casey agree to lie? What made a 16-year-old girl accuse her stepfather of such a heinous crime? The answer came in the most unexpected way. The next day, a new waitress appeared at Uncle Sam's, a young girl of about 20. During her break, she was talking on the phone by the back door of the kitchen, and Ford overheard part of the conversation. "Casey, I told you then that it was a bad idea." "No, I haven't forgotten what you told me. But 7 years have passed. Maybe it's time to finally tell the truth?" Ford cautiously moved closer. "I understand you're afraid of Mark, but that man is out now. Yes, I saw him in the neighborhood, Casey. He has a right to know that Mark made you lie." Ford's heart was beating so loudly that he was sure the whole kitchen could hear it. So Mark had coerced Casey into giving false testimony. But how? And why? When the girl finished her conversation, Ford approached her. "Excuse me, I overheard you talking to Casey Thompson?" The girl tensed up. "Who are you?" "A family friend. My name is Ford." The girl's face paled. "Oh my God, are you Ford Miller?" "Yes, and I think you have something to tell me." The girl's name was Maria Vasquez, and she turned out to be Casey's high school classmate. When Ford introduced himself, the fear in her eyes gave way to curiosity and sympathy. "I always knew something was wrong," Maria said, looking around nervously. "Casey was my best friend, but after the trial she changed. She became withdrawn and started drinking." "What exactly did she tell you?" "Not here. The manager might hear us. Let's meet after my shift at the bus stop." The next 4 hours of work dragged on endlessly. Ford mechanically washed plates, but his thoughts were preoccupied with the upcoming conversation. Finally, at 10 o'clock in the evening, he met Maria at the bus stop. "Casey told me the truth 6 months after the trial," the girl began, lighting a cigarette with trembling hands. She was pregnant at the time and very scared. She said she couldn't keep quiet anymore. "What truth?" "That she lied in court. That you never touched her. That it was all the idea of her biological father, Mark." Ford felt a familiar wave of rage rising in his chest, but forced himself to speak calmly. "How exactly did it happen?" "Mark showed up at their house in early October 2017. Casey barely remembered him. He had left them when she was 2. But he convinced Debbie that he had changed, that he wanted to be a family." Maria paused and went on. A week later, Mark was alone with Casey. He told her he knew about her boyfriend, Diego Morales, that he knew they were intimate. So what? She was only 16. Diego was older. He had just turned 18 in August. According to Arizona law, that meant being with someone younger could get him in serious trouble. Mark told Casey that if she didn't cooperate in their plan to remove you, he would report Diego to the police. Ford closed his eyes as the situation became painfully clear. Mark had taken advantage of the girl's fear for the boy to pressure her into lying. But why target me? Why not just file for divorce? "Money," Maria replied simply. "Casey overheard Mark and her mother discussing your insurance policy. In a divorce, Debbie would get half the assets. This way, she gets everything, plus the insurance." "What about the medical evidence?" Maria looked away. Mark made her prepare. He told her to use objects to make the injuries look convincing. Casey said it was very painful, but Mark said it was either that or Diego would go to prison for 15 years. Ford felt hatred filling every cell of his body. A grown man had forced a 16-year-old girl to maim herself in order to send an innocent man to prison. "Where is Diego now?" "He died in a car accident in 2019. Casey took it hard. He was the father of her child. Did Mark know about that?" "Of course. He knew everything about Casey even before he came back. He studied her life and found her weak spot." "Why didn't Casey tell the truth after Diego died?" Maria nervously stubbed out her cigarette. "Have you seen how Casey lives now? Mark told her that if she talked, he would accuse her of perjury. She would go to prison, and her child would be taken away to an orphanage. Casey is afraid of losing her son. He's all she has." The next day, Saturday, Ford didn't go to work. Instead, he sat in his motel room thinking about the information he had received. He had all the pieces of the puzzle. Now he had to decide what to do next. Formally, he could have gone to the police or the prosecutor's office. But the statute of limitations on perjury had expired, the case was closed, and the main witnesses were either dead or afraid to speak. The truth would remain a truth known only to him. Debbie and Mark would continue to live in the house bought with his blood. They would continue to raise their child with money stolen from him. Casey will remain in poverty, broken by guilt and fear. Number. That won't happen. Ford decided to get a confession. He will go to Debbie and make her tell the truth. He will record it on the phone he bought last week. The truth must come out. On Sunday evening, Ford drove past the house on Rolling Hills. Mark's truck wasn't there. On Sundays, he usually went to the casino with his friends. Ford remembered this habit from when he was married to Debbie the first time. The lights were on in the house. Debbie was home alone with the child. Ford parked his bike around the corner and walked to the back door of the house. He remembered that the lock on that door had always been faulty. All you had to do was pull the handle sharply and the latch would spring open. The lock hadn't changed in 7 years. Ford quietly entered the house through the kitchen. Familiar smells hit his nostrils. Debbie still used the same air freshener. Children's drawings hung on the refrigerator, and expensive wine glasses stood on the table. The sound of the TV came from the living room. Ford turned on the voice recorder on his phone and slowly made his way there. Debbie was sitting on the sofa with her back to him, watching a movie. The child was apparently already asleep. She was wearing a silk robe, her hair loose. In her hand was a glass of red wine. "Hi, Debbie," Ford said quietly. The woman jumped, spilling wine on her robe. She turned around, and Ford saw the horror in her eyes. "Ford, how are you? What are you doing here?" "I came to talk. About old times." Debbie slowly stood up, her eyes fixed on him. She looked good, better than she had 7 years ago. Expensive facials, gym, high-quality cosmetics, all at his expense. "You're not allowed to be here. I have a restraining order." "Yes, I remember. 300 meters. But you know what, Debbie? I don't care anymore." She backed away toward the window, her hand groping for the phone on the coffee table. "I wouldn't do that," Ford said. "Let's talk first. I know the truth." "What truth?" "How you and Mark planned it all. How he made Casey lie about the insurance. How you abandoned your own daughter for money." Debbie's face paled, but her voice remained firm. "I don't know what you're talking about." "You don't know? What about Mark showing up in town 3 weeks before my arrest? What about him blackmailing Casey by threatening her boyfriend? What about him making her hurt herself for the medical exam?" With each word, Debbie grew paler. Finally, she sank into a chair. "You don't understand." "It wasn't like that." "Then explain." "Explain how the woman I loved, the woman I gave a home to, the woman I devoted 15 years of my life to, could send me to prison for a crime I didn't commit." Debbie was silent, staring at the floor. "Explain!" Ford shouted, and she flinched. "You don't understand what it was like," she suddenly blurted out. "Living with you. Your work, your plans, your decisions. I felt like a prisoner in my own home." "So you decided to get rid of me?" "I didn't want to get rid of you." "I wanted a divorce, but you would never have agreed to just give up the house. You would have fought, hired lawyers, dragged it out for years. So you made up the charges?" "I didn't make anything up," Debbie shouted. "It was Mark's idea." "He said it would be easier for everyone." "Easier? You call 7 years in prison easier?" "You were supposed to get probation. Mark said that if you took the plea bargain, you would get 2 years probation." Ford laughed, shortly and bitterly. "And I refused the deal. Because I was innocent. Mark didn't know you were so stubborn." Mark! What about Casey? What about your own daughter? Did you know what he put her through?" Debbie turned away. "Casey agreed. No one forced her. Agreed. She was 16. Mark threatened to have her boyfriend arrested. He made her mutilate herself. She chose that boy herself. I told her to stay away from older boys. Ford couldn't believe what he was hearing. Debbie was blaming her 16-year-old daughter for being manipulated by an adult man. And then you threw her out. As soon as you got the money. We have different lives now, Debbie said coldly. Casey made her choice. I made mine. Your choice? You chose money over your daughter? I chose a future. Mark gives me what you could never give me. Stability, security. With my money. With the money I earned by living with you for 15 years. Ford felt something break inside him. This woman, sitting in his chair, in his house, bought with his hard-earned money, justified the destruction of his life by saying she deserved a reward for her patience. Deserved, he repeated slowly. You deserved. Yes, I deserved it. Do you think it was easy to pretend to be a happy wife all these years? To endure your touch, your plans for the future, your concern for Casey? Pretend? Of course, pretend. Do you think I loved you? I was young, foolish, with a child in my arms. You seemed reliable. But love? Never. The words hit Ford harder than a physical blow. 15 years of his life, 15 years of love, care, plans for the future. It was all a lie. So, all this time, he began. All this time I was waiting for the chance to start a real life, Debbie interrupted. And when Mark came back, I got it. Ford slowly approached her. Debbie tried to get up, but he grabbed her arm. Let me go. No. You're going to record this. You're going to tell the truth on tape. Never. Debbie tried to break free, but Ford held her tight. She swung her free arm and her nails left bloody streaks on his cheek. You ruined my life, Ford growled, shaking her. 7 years. 7 years of hell. Let go. Debbie grabbed a vase from the table and hit him over the head with it. Ford staggered but didn't let go of her arm. The vase shattered on the floor. Help! Debbie screamed. Help! But the neighbors were far away, and her cries were lost in the sound of the television. Debbie tried to reach the phone, but Ford pulled her back. She fell, hitting her head on the edge of the coffee table. Debbie? She didn't answer. She lay motionless, her eyes closed. A dark pool slowly spread beneath her head. Debbie! Ford knelt beside her and felt for her pulse. Nothing. No, 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 he whispered, shaking her shoulders. Get up! Debbie, get up! But she didn't get up. Her eyes remained closed, her body limp. Ford sat on the floor next to the body of the woman he once loved, realizing what had happened. He didn't want to kill her. He just wanted a confession, the truth. But now, she was dead, and he was a murderer. Outside, he heard the sound of a car pulling up. Mark was coming back. Ford jumped up, grabbed his phone, and rushed to the back door. He ran out into the yard, jumped over the fence, and ran down the alley to his bike. The door of the house slammed behind him. Then he heard Mark shout, "Debbie! Oh my God, Debbie!" Ford got on his bike and rode away without looking back. His heart was beating so hard it felt like it was about to jump out of his chest. At the motel, Ford locked himself in his room and sat down on the bed. His hands were shaking, and his face was covered with scratches from Debbie's fingernails. There were bloodstains on his clothes, hers and his. What had he done? He wanted the truth. He wanted justice. He didn't want to kill. But now Debbie was dead, and with her died the possibility of official recognition of her guilt. Ford took off his blood-stained shirt and stuffed it into a trash bag. He took a shower, washing away the blood and sweat. But it was impossible to wash away the memories of the last minutes of Debbie's life. At 10:30 in the evening, he heard sirens. Lots of sirens heading towards rolling hills. Ford turned on the local news. The first reports were already on the air. Murder in North Tucson woman found dead in her own home, police search for suspect. His description had not yet been released, but it was only a matter of time. Mark had surely told the police that he was the victim's ex-husband, recently released from prison on charges of domestic violence. Ford lay down on the bed and closed his eyes. Tomorrow they would come for him. Tomorrow it would all be over. But at least the truth was recorded on his phone. Debbie's confession. It was incomplete, but it was enough for the world to know that 7 years ago, an innocent man had been sent to prison on false charges. Detective James Harrison arrived at the crime scene at 10:35 p.m. In his 30 years with the Tucson Police Department, he had seen many domestic murders, but this case promised to be special. "What do we have?" he asked Sergeant Rodriguez. Debbie Miller, 42 years old, found by her husband around 10 p.m. in the living room with a head injury. Death was caused by bleeding in the brain. There are signs of a struggle at the scene, a broken vase, overturned furniture. Harrison examined the body. Debbie was lying next to a coffee table with traces of blood on the corner, a classic picture of an accident during a fight. "Where's the husband?" "Mark Thompson is giving a statement in the car. He says he left for the casino around 6 in the evening, came back, and found his wife dead." "Checked his alibi?" "Casino cameras confirm his presence from 6:30 to 9:45 p.m., plus credit card receipts." Harrison nodded. Mark Thompson didn't fit the profile of a murderer. But then who did? "Any ideas about suspects?" Rodriguez opened his notebook. Thompson mentioned the victim's ex-husband, Ford Miller. He was released from state prison a month ago after serving 7 years for domestic violence and child molestation. The victim was the stepdaughter of the murdered woman. "Interesting. Where is he now?" "He works at a diner on Grant Road and lives at the Desert Star Motel. I've already sent a patrol car." But Ford wasn't at the motel. His room was empty, although his belongings were still there. The motel manager said he had seen him in the morning, but he hadn't returned in the evening. Ford spent the night in an abandoned building near the train station. He knew he would be found soon, but he wanted to use every minute of freedom to think about the situation. At dawn, he turned on his phone and listened to the recording of his conversation with Debbie. The quality was not ideal, but the main points were clear. It was Mark's idea. Mark said it would be easier for everyone. Casey agreed. No one forced her. "All this time, I've been waiting for the chance to start a real life." It wasn't a full confession, but it was enough to cast doubt on the events of 7 years ago. Ford forwarded the recording to the local newspaper, the Tucson Daily Star, with a detailed letter explaining the context. He then sent copies to the district attorney's office and the office of the public defender. Let the world know the truth, even if he had to pay for it himself. On Monday morning, Detective Harrison questioned Mark Thompson at the station. The man looked shaken but remained confident. "Tell me about your relationship with Ford Miller," the detective began. "What relationship?" "I hardly knew him. He married Debbie while I was away." "But you knew about his release?" Mark paused. "Debbie mentioned it. She was worried he might try to contact her." "Did he threaten your family?" "Not directly, but Debbie was afraid. She said he might seek revenge." "For what? For turning him in? For putting him in prison?" Harrison took notes. There was something unsaid in Mark's words, but the detective couldn't figure out what it was yet. "Tell me about the events of 7 years ago. When exactly did you return to Tucson?" "In November 2017, after Ford's arrest. Debbie was in shock and needed support." "What a coincidence." Mark shrugged. "I heard about what happened from mutual friends. I couldn't leave Debbie alone in that situation." Meanwhile, patrol officers found Ford at the bus station. He didn't resist arrest and even seemed relieved. "Ford Miller, you are under arrest on suspicion of murder," Officer Martinez said as he handcuffed him. "I know," Ford replied quietly. "I've been waiting for you." At the station, Harrison sat across from Ford in the interrogation room. The suspect looked tired but calm. "Where were you last night between 8 and 10? "At Debbie's house." The honest answer surprised the detective. Usually, murder suspects tried to lie about their alibi. "Why did you go there?" "I wanted to talk to her." to find out the truth about what happened 7 years ago. What truth? Ford told the whole story about the false accusations, Mark and Debbie's conspiracy, Casey's coercion, the financial motives. Harrison listened with growing interest. Do you have any evidence to support these claims? I have a recording of my conversation with Debbie. She partially confessed. What happened after the conversation? Ford paused, then said quietly, she tried to run away. We fought. She fell and hit her head. I didn't mean to kill her. But you did. Yes, I did. While Ford was giving his testimony, the Tucson Daily Star editorial office was examining the recording they had received by email. Journalist Michael Reeves listened to the audio file several times, then contacted the prosecutor's office. We have material that could change the perception of a 7-year-old case, he told the assistant district attorney. By Monday evening, the recording had reached Detective Harrison. After listening to it, he realized that the case was much more complicated than a simple revenge killing. On Tuesday, Harrison drove to the Saguaro East Trailer Park. Casey Thompson met him at the door of her home, holding her 2-year-old son in her arms. Miss Thompson, I'm Detective Harrison. We need to talk about your mother. Casey turned pale. What's wrong with Mom? She's dead. She was killed last night. The girl sank down on the steps, clutching her child. Oh my God. Who? Ford Miller, your ex-stepfather. Casey began to cry, quietly, hopelessly. Harrison waited a few minutes, then continued cautiously. We need your testimony about the events of 2017. Information has come to light that casts doubt on the veracity of your accusations. At the time, Casey looked up at him through tear-filled eyes. What information? Harrison played the recording of Ford's conversation with Debbie. When the recording ended, Casey was silent for a long time. Miss Thompson? My mother is dead, she whispered. Mark can't threaten me anymore. Diego has also been dead for 3 years. What are you saying? Casey wiped her tears and looked the detective in the eye. Ford Miller never touched me. I lied in court. Mark made me do it. Casey's testimony turned the case upside down. She told of Mark's coercion, of threats against her boyfriend, of how she had to injure herself for the medical examination. Why did you keep quiet all these years? Harrison asked. At first, I was afraid for Diego. Then Mark threatened that if I spoke up, I would be jailed for perjury and my son would be taken away. After Diego died, I wanted to tell the truth, but who needed it? Ford was already in prison, and my mother got what she wanted. And now? Now everyone is dead. My mother, Diego. Ford will probably get life in prison too, and I'm just tired of carrying this burden. On Wednesday, the prosecutor's office announced a review of the 2017 case. Mark Thompson was arrested on charges of coercion to give false testimony and insurance fraud. A search of his home turned up documents confirming his role in the conspiracy against Ford. But for Ford himself, the news came too late. He was sitting in a pre-trial detention cell, awaiting trial on second-degree murder charges. The lawyer assigned to Ford was more experienced than Stevens had been 7 years earlier. He planned to build his defense on the emotional state of his client and the circumstances of the case. We have a chance to get a lighter sentence, he explained to Ford. Given the circumstances of the false accusation and 7 years of unjust imprisonment, the jury may show understanding. Ford listened half-heartedly. The truth had come out. His name had been cleared, and the guilty parties had been punished. But the price had been too high. He had killed a man, albeit one who had ruined his life. Mr. Miller, said the lawyer, are you listening to me? Yes, Ford replied, but it doesn't matter. I am guilty of murder. The rest doesn't matter. It does. Society needs to understand the context of your actions. Ford looked out the cell window at the same desert landscape of Arizona he had seen 7 years ago, from the bus on the way to prison. You know what's the saddest thing? He said. I got what I wanted. The truth came out. Everyone found out I was innocent. But to do that, I had to become guilty of another crime. Justice is a strange thing. Sometimes, in pursuing it, we lose our right to it. 3 months later, Ford Miller was sentenced to 12 years in prison for manslaughter. Mark Thompson received 5 years for coercion to commit perjury and fraud. Casey Thompson gave an interview to a local newspaper in which she apologized to Ford and the community for her lies 7 years earlier. She got a job at a supermarket and tried to build a normal life for herself and her son. The house on Rolling Hills Drive was sold to cover legal costs. The money partially compensated Ford for the moral damage caused by the false accusation, but most of it went to lawyers and to support Debbie and Mark's orphaned son. Stories of injustice often end with the triumph of truth, but sometimes the truth comes too late and costs too much. Ford Miller knew this better than anyone. He was acquitted in one case and charged in another on the same day. Justice prevailed, but no one was happier for it.